Hello and welcome to everyone. On behalf of the Kroc Institute for International Peace Studies, I would like to welcome you to our symposium today. For those of you who are new here, the Kroc Institute is a center for the study of the causes of violent conflict and strategies for sustainable peace. And we are housed here at Notre Dame's Hughes School of Global Affairs. The Kroc has an interdisciplinary faculty that includes anthropologists, as well as political scientists, sociologists, historians, psychologists, theologians, philosophers, and religious studies scholars. And our faculty researches a wide range of topics related to peace and justice. The Kroc Institute also has an interdisciplinary PhD program that offers joint doctoral degrees with 6 Notre Dame departments, and we support the International Peace Studies concentration in the Masters of Global Affairs program at the Kyiv School. And we also have undergraduate majors and minors in peace studies, and we have a network of 1,700 Kroc alumni from around the world. So a shout out to all of our alums who are watching today. So I am grateful to my colleague at the Kyiv School, Julia Kowalski, who is an anthropologist here at Notre Dame, for inviting me to mediate this very interesting event. Julia is an assistant professor of global affairs at the Kyiv School and a concurrent assistant professor of anthropology and in the gender studies program. And I'm delighted to have had the chance to meet Kate Martineau, an assistant professor in the Department of Asian and Asian American Studies at Binghamton University. My name is Anne Mischie, and I'm an associate professor of sociology and peace studies, and I'm part of the core faculty here at the Kroc Institute. My own work is on social movements, political culture, and democratic politics, and I've recently been focusing on the use of futures thinking and foresight methods in transnational social change efforts. So welcome everybody to the conversation. And Julia and Kate, would you like to tell us why we are here and what this is all about?
Thank you, Anne, and thank you, Julia, and the Kroc Institute, Hannah and Lisa, for supporting us. And thanks, Anne, so much for coming and joining us here. So Julia and I have been putting together this series, which is going to happen, that brings together anthropologists and peace studies scholars to discuss how ideas of justice thrive in particular contexts. So especially inspired by recent events over the last year, we're asking how conditions, institutions, interactions, ideologies mediate ideas of justice. This series seeks to expand our understanding of how justice works beyond its use as a universal concept. And I, kind of in the sense of thinking about justice and recognizing the absence of justice, we also want to acknowledge that we are having this conversation on heritage native land. And we want to, University of Notre Dame is located on traditional homelands of Native peoples, including the Haudenosaunee, Miami, Peoria, and especially the Pokagon Potawatomi. And these people have been using this land for education for thousands of years, and they continue to do so. I am speaking from the homelands of the Haudenosaunee, Oneida, as well as the Susquehanna. So I think Julie's going to share with us about the series itself.
Yeah, so thanks to both of you. I'll just echo thanks to Kroc for hosting this series. So the series has taken shape and will continue to take shape over the coming 6 weeks. So every week, a recording will be released of a dialogue between an anthropologist who we invited to participate in the event and a scholar at Kroc, a peace studies scholar. And you can see the full listing for this event at the website for the series on Kroc's website. So, we're in an interesting position today with this conversation because of this sort of new affordances of remote modalities like Zoom. Kate and I actually have already participated in these recorded conversations. And so we're simultaneously introducing you to the themes that brought us to these topics and serving almost like discussants, reflecting back on what we observed in these conversations and what is to come as we share them with you. So we're delighted to welcome you to join us today.
Okay, so our charge is to launch this event, which the series called Mediating Justice, Law, Violence, and Ethnography. So Julia and Kate asked me to share a couple of reflections to start us off. And in thinking about this event, I have been reflecting on some of the ways in which we use the term justice here at the Kroc Institute, and particular about some of the ways in which we in peace studies put the term justice in dialogue with the term peace. So I think there are at least 3 different approaches that are relevant to the conversation, and I think they all connect the term justice with ideas about mediation that I know that you would like to bring into the conversation. So first of all, many of us here at the Kroc Institute study and work in places around the world that are emerging from or trying to prevent the recurrence of episodes of violent conflict. So we don't call them post-conflict settings, as we know that conflict is always present, even in so-called peaceful societies. But in these kinds of contexts, peace is sometimes seen as being in tension with justice. So when peace treaties or accords are negotiated to try to stop the fighting, sometimes there's a concern that bringing perpetrators to justice will make it harder to stop the fighting. They'll make former combatants less willing to give up their weapons. If you insist too strongly on human rights or criminal trials or restitution of land or resources, that this will get in the way of establishing peace. So in this perspective, justice is seen as being in tension with peace. But there's another approach in which establishing justice is not seen as an obstacle, but rather as an essential component in building sustainable peace. So this is the idea behind John Paul Lederach's idea of just peace, the one-word idea of just peace, which he defines as a dynamic state of affairs in which the reduction and the management of violence and the achievement of social and economic justice are undertaken as mutual reinforcing dimensions of constructive change. So in this view, you can't build long-term peace without addressing the need for justice. And justice is not just like a legal status, as in like equality before the law, but it also has social and economic components. So in this view, justice is not in tension, but is intrinsic to peace. And then finally, in peace studies, we also pay really close attention to calls for justice as they underlie protest and mobilization around the world, as in the call, no justice, no peace. So in this case, activists and citizens are in the streets because they are concerned about the absence of justice or with the experience of deep social injustice, racial, economic, gendered, environmental, or other forms of inequality, exclusion, or oppression. Injustice thus calls forth social disruption, disturbances of the so-called peace in the form of protest mobilization. So we've got these three views here: justice as sometimes in tension with peace, justice as sometimes seen as being intrinsic to peace, and at other times calls for justice leading to a righteous disruption of the peace. So justice is clearly no simple matter, hence the need for mediation. So let's turn it back to you both now. As anthropologists, just to kind of give you a snapshot of the kinds of conversations about justice that we're having here in peace studies at the Kroc Institute, what lens do you as anthropologists bring to the problem of justice, and how did this particular perspective lead you to organize this event?
Thanks, Anne. Yeah, so I'll start to answer that question by giving a little bit of the history of the approach that Kate and I are taking. So, this project is in some ways the product of a long and ongoing conversation that the two of us have been having that arises from a shared empirical interest in the study of mediation processes. So interactive activities that are self-consciously labeled as mediation. So for example, I've been spending a long time, over a decade, studying family counseling practices in North India, which are a branch of a larger set of processes called alternate dispute resolution, or ADR, that have sprouted up all over the world as these kind of paralegal or legally plural ways of addressing issues like domestic violence, drug crime, so on and so forth. Kate also has been embarking on a project where she's studying restorative justice processes, including through training in various forms of restorative justice practice and other kinds of justice practices like nonviolent communication. And so as anthropologists observing these processes, we've long had a lot to say to each other about it. And we've come to know and learn from our interlocutors at our field sites that justice itself is often at stake as people navigate the correct or the needed interactive forms that mediation processes have to take. And so we know, as Anne herself has just pointed out so clearly, that just because people can come to a consensus over a shared outcome doesn't make that outcome just. On the flip side, a commitment to justice can make a shared consensus over an outcome almost impossible. Communities feel like it's permanently out of reach, and that these orientations to justice are enormously complex and shift over time. And this led us to start to question the role of justice in these processes, both as an empirical concept in the field for our interlocutors, as a commitment that we ourselves hold as researchers, and as a topic that's been really richly and deeply explored in other fields. And so I think Anne did such a great job of laying out the sophistication with which peace studies in particular, as it's practiced across all these different disciplines, approaches these questions of justice. And this is why we thought it would be enormously interesting to pair peace studies scholars, particularly those who might be working across scholarship and practice, with anthropologists who are studying topics and themes related to questions of justice and who center justice in their own fieldwork. And so I'll turn to Kate.
Yeah, I'll jump in. Yeah, I wanted to say a little bit about what I think that anthropology brings to this, and kind of what perspective, because I don't have a background in peace studies, and I'm really learning about transformative justice and restorative processes by doing it and by being a student of it in trainings and things like that. And I just want to recognize that like all of my thinking about this comes especially from like women of color who are doing just amazing work in the area of transformative justice. And so these ideas didn't start here. But the kind of view that anthropology allows us to take, and Anne, thank you so much for laying that out. I was scribbling notes. But what is a little bit different is that when, anthropologists are kind of the greatest skeptics maybe of the social science world. And so we come kind of not yet committed to a particular concept. At least that's often our kind of methodological framework. And what anthropology is really good at is, I think there are two things that anthropology, and especially the kind of anthropology that Julia and I do and come out of, which is really linguistically or semiotically informed anthropology. I think we're really good at two things, and I mean, not just two, sounds just two things, but I think there are kind of these two things that we're especially good at. One is identifying assumptions that are in play in a situation, and especially how those assumptions can lead to silences and frictions among participants in the situation. And then the second thing that I think we have some really good analytical tools for is connecting across scales in a situation. So we here are in this interpersonal conversation, kind of face-to-face, mediated by Zoom, and yet what we're doing here is in relationship to other scales of activity. And so we might be thinking about, capitalism and certain forms of capitalism. We might be thinking about neoliberal understandings of the self as anthropologists and how those play out here. We might be thinking about forms of whiteness, right? White public space, and how those are influencing what we're doing here. So there are lots of anthropological tools that are really good for connecting how these scales influence each other. And we think both about how the kind of broader scale is influencing the situation that we're in, but also how the situation we're in might be reproducing or inflecting or changing those broader structures. And so what we're interested in bringing this to think about justice is how is it that justice is being shaped this way? What kinds of assumptions are underlying justice? And how does it connect to multiple scales? How is it working across scales when we use these ideas? But we want to bring it to peace studies as a conversation exactly because of the reasons that Anne laid out for us, which are that there are these really sophisticated understandings of justice in practice in peace studies that anthropologists often kind of have a bit of a distance in our scholarly frameworks. And so I think peace studies, and especially so many people here in peace studies, are doing facilitation work and are doing on the ground kind of, how do we sort this out in a community? So that's why we're here.
Great. I wonder if I can, before we turn to what you learned from this conversation, just to dig in a little bit more to this idea that you don't go, like an anthropologist doesn't go into a field site with a preconceived notion of what justice is. They look to see how justice is being expressed and negotiated and contested in a particular context. Can you make that come alive for us? Can you make that concrete for us? What kind of a situation might we, especially, let's say, the kind of situations I mentioned earlier, which are either having experienced or threatened with or trying to prevent, violent conflict, and what, in those kinds of contexts, what conflicting conceptions of justice might we need to be attuned to?
Yeah, well, so I'll dive in there. I have a lot of answers to that. And I know that Kate does too. But I'll dive in by starting to talk a little bit about what we mean when we talk about mediation in particular, and how an attention to mediation as a semiotic process, so a process of meaning making and interpretation, shifts how we pay attention to abstract concepts that might be held out as a shared goal in, for example, social context where people are emerging out of years of overt violent conflict, or a situation where people are trying to maybe pull a history of violence into public view and begin to have conversations about restitution and reparations, which is maybe what we're experiencing in the contemporary United States. So, when on the one hand, we talked already about how Kate and I have this shared interest that we share with many people at Kroc in mediation as a explicit interactive process. So you sit people in a room and they talk to each other and you mediate and there's some outcome that is hopefully positive. But we also, in calling this event Mediating Justice, we were referring to mediation in a different way, which is as a conceptual and analytic framework that we use to analyze the world. And so I have been tasked with explaining what we mean as semiotically oriented anthropologists who are thinking about mediation. And so as folks trained in this tradition, and this is something we share with scholars across many disciplines, we see mediation as a background process in every social interaction and social process. It's something people are doing all the time as they interpret and act on the world around them. It's something all of you in the audience are doing in diverse ways as you interact with this and whatever else is happening on your computer screens. And by approaching mediation in this way, we treat objects of thought, discourse, and social manipulation as semiotic and thus culturally constituted entities. And that's a passage from a well-known text by Elizabeth Mertz and Richard Parmentier, who are foundational scholars in this field of thinking. But we can extend this insight, this idea that objects are culturally constituted entities, and we can move beyond objects of thought like justice, to also thinking about stuff, things, persons, places, concrete social processes, as also being continually constituted and reconstituted through mediation. So by focusing on mediation as this background process that we might not always be fully reflectively aware of as participants in the social world, we can better understand how signs come to have meaning, as well as how signs mediate contexts, processes, relations. So this is a theory of attending to signs and meaning that allows us to pull social context and into the frame and consider it profoundly as a central force in what's legible and meaningful to participants. And in turn, to appreciate the many ways that this kind of semiotic activity can act on and reframe social context for good or for not. Depending on whose perspective we're taking. So that's a pretty abstract definition, but I know that we have an example ready as well.
Yeah, I want to talk about maybe a couple examples first, and I think Julia, you could also, like, based on your fieldwork, I think you could also respond to Anne's question, because I think your fieldwork is exactly this kind of case where we bring in ideas of justice and they can actually do a lot more harm. And you know, one thing I've been thinking hard about lately with the work of Dorothy Roberts is, for instance, like the removal of children from the home in the foster care system, and how that's framed as a project of justice, but as Dorothy Roberts' work like fully illustrates, it actually does a lot more harm. And so some kinds of ideas, you come in with a certain concept of justice, and actually what you do is a lot of harm in that situation. And so those are the kinds of situations that I think we're hoping to kind of be able to create a dialogue around. And so I don't have a lot of experience in situations of, say, ongoing conflict. Well, I suppose I have some, but I want to also share an example that I think brings out some of why it is that some concepts of justice don't work for everybody in the situation. And I've been thinking a lot lately with this example from a 2020 piece in American Anthropologist by Jonathan Rosa and Vanessa Diaz. And it's called, the piece is called Ratio Ontologies. And in the piece, they go through many other examples, but they give this example and analyze it. And I think it's just such a beautiful illustration of some of the processes of mediation and how they impact justice. So they're looking at the 2013 trial of George Zimmerman for the killing of Trayvon Martin, a 15-year-old African-American boy walking on a street in his neighborhood. And during the trial, Zimmerman argued that he was justified in killing this unarmed teenager because he had perceived Martin as carrying a weapon, when in fact what Martin was actually carrying was a bag of Skittles and a can of juice. Then, in the closing arguments, Zimmerman's defense attorney brought to the courtroom a piece of cement. He lays it on the floor. It's a piece of sidewalk. And he says, like, look at this. This teenager was not unarmed. He was armed with the sidewalk he was standing on. And you know, he's kind of referring to this alleged physical altercation between Zimmerman and Martin. But he's successful. Zimmerman is acquitted. And so the question is, how is it that a man holding a gun, Zimmerman holding a gun, is seen as equal, as equivalent to a teenage boy standing on a sidewalk, right? That's what's happening in that trial, is those two things are made equivalent. So Rosa and Diaz's argument is that this whole situation is being mediated by, they say, inhabited and animated by normative whiteness. So this example shows that what counts as candy, or what counts as a weapon, or what counts as a piece of the landscape, or what counts as a weapon, is not the same for everyone, and it's not obvious. But that in fact, here in this case, racist norms of whiteness mediate the very conditions of being a person or being a thing. And so I think this example shows how powerful mediation can be in shaping who gets justice, what kind of justice it is, what are the objects of justice, and what is it that's even brought into the question of being relevant to justice. And so Julie and I want to bring this perspective to many different situations. We want to kind of open this conversation about what it is that in Rosa and Diaz's words is inhabiting and animating justice.
So can you tell me, or tell all of us, something more about the way in which you decided to pair these particular, I think they're pairs of people together for these conversations? You know, I noted that you, in each case, you have an anthropologist and you have somebody related to the Kroc, often someone who would identify as a scholar practitioner, in some cases people who identify as mediators in a professional way. And so there's a sense in which you're talking about mediation as something that we all do all the time, particularly in situations of conflict, but we're all encountering conflictual, tense situations all the time as well. So when you have a professional mediator coming in, mediation is something that you do in a particular circumstance, you bring people together to a table and you try to iron out the differences. So that's two questions. One is, why did you bring these people together? But especially, why did you bring people together who think about mediation as something that we do all the time, and with people who do mediation in a particular, very much more specific way as a form of professional and political intervention?
Should I jump in there? Because I have strong feelings about this. In beginning the trainings in transformative and restorative justice practices, one thing I've really become aware of and been so impressed by is the depth of the practical knowledge of exactly these semiotic processes that facilitators have. And so facilitators are doing all of this. They are attentive. A good facilitator is attentive to these multiple scales of knowledge, or those multiple scales of kind of conditioning that are happening, and the power that a particular interaction has to change a community's situation, to change what's happening in a community. And so, I think for me, the interest in bringing facilitators and anthropologists together was precisely because there is so much practical knowledge. And in the case of Kroc, not just practical knowledge. I mean, these are also scholars that we were talking with. And so we really wanted to bring out how do they know about this and how do they do it? Julia, do you want to add anything there?
Yeah, I mean, so I would echo what Kate has said in terms of the kinds of, there's lots of different ways to be sophisticated about a concept. And so bringing together these different kind of vocabularies of understanding the role of mediation. I think another, I don't know if this was the intention, I guess we're looking forward for the audience, but back in time. So maybe this is a bit of retconning of the process of putting this together. But one thing that I think also really came out and was really quite interesting as well is that, I think a lot of anthropologists, I don't want to speak for all of our participants, but I think for many cultural anthropologists, we do research the way we do it because we ourselves hold strong commitments to justice, something that we think is justice, right? There's a reason why we're studying the state as anthropologists and not from a different disciplinary perspective. And that's this sort of background set of commitments that informs our methodologies and how we train graduate students and how we think about what's valuable in the field. And yet, we don't often have overt conversations about what that is. And so something else that really came out of these conversations for me was that when you have folks who are scholar practitioners who are engaging in these activities with a shared set of, having to orient around a shared set of goals with a community, that often forces people to ask themselves much more sophisticated questions about their commitments and how those commitments shape their work. And this is something I kind of already knew from interacting with scholars at Kroc over the past few years. And that's something that I think it was really interesting to sort of watch develop in our dialogues between participants, was sort of seeing some of what is often background, I think, for anthropologists get a bit more externalized as a set of normative commitments, which we are ambivalent about having as social scientists a little bit sometimes.
So thinking about these conversations, I know that methodologically for anthropology, surprise is really a key tool in your toolbox for social inquiry. You look for places. First thing you do when you go to a research situation is figure out what surprises you. So can you share with us what surprised you about these conversations?
Sorry, I was writing down surprise as a key part of my toolkit for social inquiry. I guess I like that turn of phrase.
No, I quote you to my sociology grad students all the time. Anthropologists just say the surprise is the first thing you do when you get to the field is see what surprises you. So from my point of view, that's I credit that to you guys.
No, I will say increasingly I instruct people to look for what bores them the most, because I think that's that really important things are happening. Right.
Yeah, we have not answered your question, Anne.
Yeah, go ahead.
We're being highly evasive here. Yeah. So I think one thing I was surprised by to build on what I was just saying, was the extent to which I had not actually interrogated my own commitments to justice as a scholar in the kind of sophisticated terms that I was hearing people deploy on the Kroc side of things. And even actually some of our anthropologists also actually had a more sophisticated approach to this, that there is a set of, I mean, not that anybody, I don't want to do false advertising, there is no clear definition of justice that emerges across these videos, but listening to folks who are operating on the peace studies side of things ask themselves and us this series of questions about justice. Like, I think even, you know, the way that you kicked us off today, Anne, with this like very sophisticated set of understandings was new for me as a scholar, particularly reflecting back on my own scholarly practice. And I think that, again, has made me reflect a lot on how, even as justice becomes central to how we articulate our value as cultural anthropologists, that we don't always fully unpack what are we doing as we think about justice, what mediates our approach to justice, with some exceptions like the article by Rosa Diaz that Kate just mentioned. But so that took me by surprise, with some of the sort of lacuna in our own scholarly conversations.
And I just want to say, you know, looking now back and looking forward to the conversations, you know, it was, I can't help but reflect on it as a facilitator, because it was like academic blind dates, and there are lots of awkward moments. And so, you know, viewers have that to look forward to. Like, there's this really lovely kind of what happens when you put two people who don't know each other in a room together. And so that was, I think the thing that maybe was surprising is that in each conversation, it started to gel. Like, there was something that started to happen where, there's a shared conversation or a shared interest that emerges. And these are all people who didn't know each other ahead of time. And so that's really fun to see happen in 20 minutes. And of course, we put them together because we felt like there would be a shared conversation, but that was just our attempt to matchmake in that case. And so it was always a real pleasure to see that occur. And I think one of the things is I sort of expected people to come in with their understanding of justice being something that they work with, and maybe sort of armed with scholarly definitions of justice. And that happened in none of the conversations. Nobody came in and said, oh, well, justice is this thing. Instead, it was really this problem for everybody to think through. And I would say that we are in a place where, in fact, we are all saying, our universalizing kind of European liberal understandings of justice that we have instituted in our criminal justice system, they don't work. And so we need some other way to be talking together about what our goals are and about what our projects are. And so I felt like that was a shared spirit across all of the participants.
Interesting. Let me just invite, we don't have any questions yet from the audience, but let me at this point really invite people to submit questions via the Q&A, and those will be transmitted to the Google Doc that I have open up on the side so that I can communicate it to Kate and Julia. So I really would welcome people. This is your chance to actually tap an anthropologist to you know, get your take on these really interesting questions about justice and mediation. I guess we started.
Can I interrupt for a second? Because I would really love to hear Julia kind of respond to your earlier question that was about, like, what is it that's happening in your situation where people come in with ideas of justice and try to put them in and it doesn't work, right? Like, there's pushback, there's frustration, there's suffering. What is it that happens that you see?
Right. So part of the issue here is why is justice a problem on the ground that needs to be mediated? Yeah. That's the question. Yeah.
Yeah. I think there's a lot of answers to that question, including the fact that as a lot of scholars who study transnational processes surrounding phenomena like human rights are starting to show us, it's really, really hard to implement universalizing targets or definitions of things like justice and rights without also doing violence or accidentally facilitating or perpetrating existing forms of structural violence. And I think, I think we see that here in the United States. I don't actually think you need to go too far afield to really observe that. I do field work in North India, so that's where I observe it, but I don't think that this is a unique phenomenon in North India, or that North India is particularly outside the pale or culturally distinctive or anything like that. I do know in my own field work that one thing that's really been brought out to me in watching people try to develop interactive strategies to support women who are facing various forms of abuse in their families is a real tension between people who want to really hold on to globally circulating visions of rights as an individual property and of independence as the kind of goal of social movements, particularly those that target gender inequality. And on the other hand, a set of intuitions and desires on the part often of clients themselves and also of counselors to cultivate better relations and better forms of interdependence. And one thing that I've seen, I have a lot to say about this, but one thing that I've really noticed is that part of the friction that results, because often what we see is that counselors and clients kind of work together towards improved relations of interdependence in the home, and the sort of people who manage these counseling centers or folks who are observing the counseling centers say, oh my God, you're sending the women back home. This is a failure. This is a failure as a women's rights intervention. We've got to fix this. You got to sensitize the counselors. Something has to change. And one thing that really comes out of this example for me is that we don't have a language, because those folks aren't wrong. It's not great to be sending these women back home to households where they're struggling often because the household doesn't have enough material resources or other things that are sort of out of everybody's control. But one thing that really comes through is that we don't have a very clear language in kind of normative liberal ideas about justice for talking about interdependence. We've got a set of frameworks and a set of visions of justice that are premised on individual action, individual behavior, and a kind of possessive individualism where you have things like rights. And so it feels really scary to start to talk about relations of dependency because we don't have a language to determine, are you depending on your kin in a good way or a bad way? It feels like we've sort of gone outside of that. And so those debates aren't always framed in terms of justice, but I think, as a shared goal, but I think it's where we really see the rubber hit the road in terms of the challenges that we face if we have overly thin or overly universalizing definitions of what justice is and does in the world. And then again, for me as a researcher, my own commitment to this sort of ethnographic perspective, leads me down a road where it can feel like I am calling into question concepts that I actually value a lot, like human rights. And so I think opening a space to have those conversations across scales, as we are very good at doing as anthropologists, from our own scholarship to really learning to listen to these other kinds of conversations wherever it is that we're carrying out our research. And again, I think Samina Mullah, who's one of our anthropology participants, she's tracking kind of similar dynamics in family courts in Milwaukee, where again, there's this set of tensions between protecting the sort of individual welfare of various participants in these family court cases with needing to sustain the family as a support and as a source of resources and welfare.
So one of the core tensions is between this universalizing understanding of justice as like equality before the law, everybody's treated the same. Being fair is that everybody's treated equally before some set of norms and principles, and a more, on the other hand, more relational, interdependent, situation-based negotiation of what, how you juggle contending, claims on relationships within a different context. So that's one, it seems like that's one of the core tensions being negotiated.
Yeah, and I will say, and I think actually, Kate, you can speak to this even better than I can. And Samina and Lori Nathan actually both spoke to this in our recordings. But one thing that starts to shift when you start to pull away from that kind of universalizing vision of justice, it's not just how you define justice, but how you think about its enactment. So several of our participants talked about how this shifts temporality. So the way, the sort of temporality through which you evaluate whether an outcome is just or not starts to shift as you start to shift your orientation towards justice as maybe something that's relational or that's embedded in community. Yeah, I'll pass this to you, Kate, because I know you've thought about this a lot.
Well, I see we have some questions coming in, and I want to make sure we get to those too. But I also do want to really reiterate this point about dependency and interdependency, and how challenging, coming from a liberal framework, it is to think about what justice would look like when we think of interdependency as a positive thing, and as a good thing that we want to encourage. Because I think so often it is in situations of dependency that we start to see injustice and feel like we need to address it. And so I think that what's one of the things I really love about your work, Julia, is how you're looking at these situations, and much like Samina's work, seeing where interdependency is really important and really valuable and needs to be supported. And yet all of the efforts to come in and produce a better situation take that interdependency apart. And there's really wonderful work. I mean, I'm thinking about this from the framework of transformative justice, where there is really exciting stuff happening in the field of transformative justice right now around how to produce kind of alternative sorts of responses to situations of harm, especially in intimate relationships or among households and things like that, where you can kind of preserve interdependency and yet create kinds of accountability frameworks that help support all of the people in that situation. And so there's really wonderful work happening in this area right now. And should we take one of the questions?
Yeah, so we've got two really interesting questions. So the first one just came in with great question for peace studies. Is what would happen if focus shifted away from justice and towards nonviolence? Interesting. Interesting, I think, in the context of what you're saying about interdependency and relationship.
Yeah, exactly. And I mean, I think about this a lot. Julia and I both have spent a lot of time in India. And so we both have a lot of experience with Gandhi's writings and people who work, well, I don't know, Julia, in your research, but in my research, I have spent a lot of time with people who are Gandhian and have really adopted Gandhian philosophies for their own life, to organize their own lives. And I've been so inspired by the idea of nonviolence. And yet, so in my experience with nonviolence, the challenge is the same challenge of mediation, which is, how do we decide what is the violence and what is the nonviolence? And so I'd love to be able to bring a framework of nonviolence, but I have the same question, which is, for whom is it nonviolent? And how will we know that it's nonviolent? I think it's a great project, nonviolence. But there are many situations that I have observed and been around where there can even be consensus about it being nonviolence. And yet there's obviously still some kind of harm taking place from a justice perspective, I would say, and maybe really thinking about, like, there's not equity in the situation. And yet everybody involved says that it's nonviolence. And in fact, this is the case in the writings of Gandhi himself, who was very comfortable maintaining caste distinctions and caste organizations of village society, and in fact advocated for it. And so a lot of the recent critiques over the last 5, even 10 years in India have focused on Gandhi's support for caste maintenance. And that clearly is a situation of, reinforcing structural violence, we might say, reinforcing lack of equity and lack of inclusion, reinforcing, the sexual availability of some women to some men. And so there's clearly not, this is not a nonviolent situation, even though it was put together in the framework of nonviolence. So
so nonviolence does not necessarily equal equity.
Yes.
Julia, do you want to respond to that one?
Oh yeah, well, just to build on the Gandhi takedown that we're all, but that part of why Gandhi was was comfortable reproducing certain ideas about caste is precisely because it provided an ordering principle to kind of take, I mean, he doesn't say like caste provides an ordering principle, but he, you know, he writes about the importance of what he sometimes calls dharma. Sometimes he calls it religion in English, and dharma is a really complex process. None of you came, or concept, none of you came here for a South Asia Studies lecture, but you know, one thing that it can be used to refer to is sort of knowing your role in a wider social order. And so it often is interwoven with assumptions about caste and the caste system and its operation and necessity. And so, but I think, you know, so part of what that might show us, if we're to be a little bit more generous about this really frustrating side of Gandhi, is that, you know, even Gandhi is looking for, well, what, when we take away these other ordering principles that are coming at us that I am telling you are violent, how else do we organize things? And so again, to use this language of mediation, part of what we see is that for Gandhi, his vision of social order continues to be mediated by a set of assumptions that requires a population of people to be subordinated, and to be subordinated for reasons attached to things like what community they're born into. And so I think this is where this approach to, I mean, whether we're talking about justice or nonviolence, attending very carefully to reiterate what Kate has said to the categories that are mediating our sense of what constitutes violence or nonviolence is really important.
Yeah, and for whom, right? Like,
and for whom?
Nonviolent, right?
Yeah.
So here's another really great question. Was there or is there a discussion that makes a distinction between law and justice? So this distinction is very clearly drawn in the colonial context by the colonized in reference to colonial laws and its injustice of the colonial laws against the local population. And now, of course, a similar discourse is circulating against the nation state and its laws and law enforcement, with justice sees law enforcement and justice as almost seen as opposing forces. Law and justice, thoughts on that?
I hope you'll watch all the recordings.
Okay.
Yes, come, because I like this.
Because I do think this was a theme that, you know, came out. We were doing the recordings in January. And a lot of things happened in January, as you may or may not recall. It's February now as we're discussing this, but and that already feels like a long time ago. But this is a theme that came up again and again and again in these discussions. And in particular, I think a discomfort that all of us involved in this have, and probably all of you in the audience have as well, with, you know, justice as the word, this word or concept appears in like the criminal justice system, which again, justice for whom versus justice as a shared goal, and trying to peel those things apart is a theme that, yeah, appears frequently. Yeah, Kate.
Yeah, I want to just say that I love this question, because I, you know, do take really seriously that laws need to be held to our community standards. And so on one hand, I want to say, well, like, law obviously isn't justice. And on the other hand, I want to say we need to own the law, and we need to make the law. Like, I want the law to be owned by the people who right now feel like it doesn't work for them. Right. So how do we make our laws the representation, the instantiation of justice for our most marginalized populations? Right. And I think that I'm saying that for many people. I don't think that's specific to me. I think that that's true for many people. And so while on one hand, we're saying like, well, laws clearly aren't justice, and look at all the harm that's done in the face of them, at the same time, like, we want them to be different. So there's some potential in lawmaking to change society. I'll just say that.
So here's a very different question that's actually speaking up in defense of human rights. So as anthropologists, how do you navigate cultural relativism as a means to obstruct justice, such as human rights violations as defined in international laws? So it sounds like someone is chiming in here to say, well, wait a second, human rights are actually quite important in many cases.
Yeah, and this is something that I think irritates people about anthropological approaches to systems like human rights. I mean, I think, so there's a couple different ways to answer this question. First of all, there's been a lot of work by anthropologists and by other scholars that have sort of looked at the ways that something that gets labeled culture, I'm about to use culture in like 3 different ways in a single sentence, so please bear with me. The ways that culture as a kind of reified object gets pointed to by conservative forces in a society to say, well, look, this is not our culture. So we shouldn't be, like, to protect our culture, we can't be subjected to these universalizing norms. What those folks mean when they say culture is usually not what anthropologists mean when they use culture as an analytic tool. But because anthropologists have been using culture for a long time, there's often a lot of slippage between that. And you can see it's deeply uncomfortable as an anthropologist to see the ways in which those kinds of conservative social actors often reach to older ethnography to say, look, this is how we resolve these conflicts. We're in Fiji, we do this, you know, dispute resolution, and we're taking care of it. But anthropologists, so Sally Engelmary, who recently passed on, but has done a lot of work on legal pluralism and on the kind of role of culture in human rights discourse, as well as in human rights activities and practices. She uses this example in much of her writing of a Fijian resolution practice called, we'll just leave it there, I don't want to mess up the name. And what she shows is that on the one hand, you have these conservative forces in Fiji saying, look, we don't need to have robust anti-gender violence laws because we take care of that stuff in this like traditional setting. And so then you have Fijian women's rights activists and human rights activists saying this is a way to prevent this from coming to legal notice, but these are crimes that you're adjudicating in these resolution centers. But part of what she's able to show in dialogue with people who she comes to know in the field is that this is actually a misuse of this cultural tool. So anyways, all of this is to say, it's really complicated, but it's also quite simple. And I think part of what we need to attend to, and again, this is where this mediation thing, I think, gets us some purchase and some clarity, where talking about culture can leave us a little bit muddled and frustrated, because part of what we can attend to is how different actors in a setting, and that can be, you know, the conservative folks who are saying, back off, this is our cultural tradition. It can also be the human rights lawyers who are saying human rights are the way to solve this. But part of what we can attend to is how these claims are being mediated by different histories of culture and its role in different discursive formations, different ideas about what cultural difference means and signifies about people who are embodying that difference in some way. So I think mediation can actually move us past what can sometimes feel like a super frustrating tension and conversation about relativism versus universalism in human rights practice.
Kate, do you want to take that on?
Yeah, I want to respond, I think, a little bit differently, which is I don't know. And this is one of the reasons I want to have this conversation. Because for me, this is one of the key challenges of thinking about justice as an anthropologist, which is that we do have normative projects. And if we don't want our normative project to be noxious and oppressive, then we need to come up with something better. And it really means a commitment to something. And how do we do that at the same time that we recognize the commitments of those that we study are going to be different from our own commitments, probably, right? And so how do we constantly work through this? And so that, I mean, that's why I wanted to have these conversations. I'm so inspired by people who have strong commitments to a normative project. And in my training, I come from a framework that has trained me to really keep a distance from those normative projects. And so, and when I say normative project, I mean it in a moral sense. And I think it's a wonderful thing. We should have projects of making the world better. But how do we carefully choose those so as to continue to, I mean, using our tools, I guess, using our tools of listening and understanding all of the mediations that occur in order for those normative processes to seem reasonable, and whose views are they supporting? I guess that's what I'll say. These are my questions. Thank you.
So I have one more question and then kind of a closing one. And that's, I mean, we've talked about the tension between universalizing versus more relational or situated or, interconnection focused understandings of justice. But even making that distinction, there still are a lot of different kinds of justice out there and a lot of different kinds of injustice and a lot of competing claims, so like we talk about like the history of like the different waves of struggles, social movements struggling for rights on the basis of justice claims, civil rights and political rights, economic, social rights, economic rights. Now we might talk about environmental justice, the rights of the earth, and these healthcare and environment and economic. There's lots of different contending claims on justice in a world of like finite resources and attention. So I'm wondering how we can go into an understanding of justice in a way that really maintains attention to the multiplicity. That's not just justice, it's justices. It's the multiplicity of the term. And the sense that while we are striving to bring many claims to justice together in an intersectional way, there will always be tension and friction between these multiple claims on or framings of a justice. So just I don't know, any thoughts on how we deal with it with how we understand the multiplicity of justices, and claims on justice and forms of injustice that shape our lives and our politics. I'm not sure if that's a question.
It's a really good point. It's a really good point. I mean, there are, and so how do we choose? I mean, I think it's been such an interesting year to be somebody who thinks a lot about what's happening in South Asia, because before the pandemic, there were, India erupted in protests over citizenship and these redefinitions of citizenship. And the country was in pieces. Everywhere there were protests. It was amazing. And then here in the United States over the summer, we had these protests and now, and I don't know, for people who are following, and I encourage you all to learn about Line 3, the fight against the pipeline in Minnesota and Wisconsin, which is happening right now. And we have just some indigenous environmental leaders there doing amazing work. And it, I feel like my attention is constantly like, oh, I want to support all of these, I want to go and be there and support. And so how is it that we manage an attention, like the finite attention problem that you're describing? How do you be decolonial and support abolition movements at the same time? How do you do these? How do you bring all these projects together? And how do you?
In part, you do it through intersectional forms of action, but still there will be moments of tension in which these different struggles, are tugging at each other.
Yeah.
Since we only have 2 minutes, let me just jump out of my question into actually closing one. Is as people are listening to these recordings, what should they be listening to? What do you, in a preparatory way, as we, as future viewers are tuning in, what should we be paying attention to? What should we be looking for and listening for?
I want to build on what you both said and say what surprises you and what bores you, but that's not really an answer at all. Kate, do you have a prepared answer to say before I launch into my real answer?
I think there are tensions, there are disagreements, and I think they are interesting to listen for because there is a lot of agreement. And so the places where, especially as a questioner, I often kind of put forward a question and I was wrong in in the thing that it assumed. I think those are really interesting moments where we'll differentiate from even the assumptions that I bring in attempting to have no assumptions. So I think that there's, even as across the conversations, there's a lot of agreement. I think that there's a lot of variation and diversity in the responses as well. And so I think one of the things that's been beautiful is how these conversations open up instead of conclude the questions. And so I would say, you know, reach out to us. We love to continue these conversations. I think this is really an invitation to more conversations. And we hope that you will accept the invitation and join us over the next couple months and be in touch.
Julia, any closing words to add?
I think that's a wonderful place to end things.
All right, well, thank you to both of you and to the Kroc Institute. And we really encourage all of you to listen to these conversations, and a lot of thoughtful reflection, both friction and generativity coming out of these conversations. So thank you all and have a good evening.
Yeah, thank you. And thanks to everyone who asked questions. Thank you, Anne, and thanks to the Kroc Institute.